from their own study, some examples from their own study and experience that might help us, might inspire us, might inspire us in a direction that's positive, or maybe to avoid something that we need to avoid right now. So I know that it's got some good examples from their reading or maybe lived experience that they're going to share, but I want to start with this question just to kind of maybe do a little definition. Just go around the horn. What comes to your mind when you think about what civil discourse even is? What does it look like for
Mm,
discourse to be civil?
mm. I'm gonna let others answer.
Chris, I'll start just to get us going. I and I think all of us feel or I'll speak for myself, that there is a complete breakdown right now on the ability for people to speak to one another. I began concerned about the communal and how we hold the communal together. I'm now down to the level of how does anybody talk to anybody else when they don't agree? So down at that level, for me, it's verbal, a verbal interchange in which both parties leave with some part of their own view, move, change, shaken. So it's got to land on both parties for me to call it discourse. I mean, at some point, I'd love to talk whether or not this panel, for example, would we call this discourse? I think it would be interesting to think about that. So that's where I'd start.
So you're picking up on this thread that there should be an exchange,
Yeah.
Which means listening, people actually hearing and understanding, and an openness to be moved. So that's in this day and in this particular moment, that isn't that a challenge? Can you go into a conversation knowing that you have disagreements with somebody, at least maybe thinking you do, but can you go into that conversation being willing to change? David or Bryan, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah. I as I was listening to Diana just now, what came to my mind is the distinction between dialectic or dialogue or even just discourse and debate. I think I've never been a fan of debate club in high school for a number of reasons, but one of them is I think that um, it teaches young people that truth is arbitrary, and you can move from one side of a something to another. I think the value in that, if there is any, is perhaps getting to see another's perspective from the inside. But I'm much more in favor of the dialectic, and that tends to be the term that I use when I'm talking to students or when I'm training teachers. Um, and what I often will encourage them to envision is that the truth is somewhere in between the two of us, right? It's on the table. I'm on this side of the table, you're on this side of the table. We're bringing our own perspectives and experiences to the dialogue, but truth is not I don't own the truth and you don't own the truth. We're looking for the truth together, and so it's somewhere outside and above us, not within me or within you. And I'm not trying to assert my truth, so to speak, on you.
So it's very interesting that we've right away noted two kind of like, well, presuppositions or assumptions that the two of you at least think should be brought to something that would be called civil discourse. Diana said a willingness to change, a kind of humility to learn from others, and then you've laid down another assumption, and that is that truth exists outside of us and is not to be so much made as to be discovered, and that we can do that communally. So I wonder if there's another assumption, Bryan, that's coming to your mind. Like, what else needs to be brought to the table, to use David's metaphor, for there to be civil discourse?
I think there has to be an interest in trying to find the truth, right? There has to be an interest. That was the first thing that came to my mind was a mutual pursuit of truth. Succinctly put, that's how I'd express it. But yeah, what's been set up to this point, I think, is really great. Spot on.
Well, then let's take a look at the word discourse once more, and then let's look at the word civil. Discourse, it seems to mean like if you're on a course, to discourse means you're willing to go this way or that, and it kind of emphasizes what Diane said. We have another word, intercourse, which seems to imply that the roads that you're traveling can become intermingled, or maybe there's two ways to get to the same place. There's something that can be shared along the way. So that's just interesting to me, even in the etymology. Is there anything else you want to say about the word before we look at civil? Anything else about discourse? David's contrasted it to dialectic and dialogue. Anything else that we want to say before we move on?
Well, I think unlike the logos ones, the discourse one coming from the Latin to run, one of the things to me that if you go through David's idea, which I agree with completely, that you have to get on the same track if we're going to continue to use the running metaphor. And what that means is if you've ever been running with anybody, or walking, you have to adjust paces so that you are in fact both moving at the same pace and towards a similar goal. But again, it requires adjustment on the part of both participants. That's why I actually like the discourse. I'm a long distance walker, so that's why I like it maybe. But I think it's useful. It doesn't make it only about words like dialogue does.
Well, thank you. So I heard that. Jump in, Anika.
Yeah, I was, and I feel like when I think of discourse, it removes fear. I think we're all oftentimes afraid of hearing ourselves be disagreed with, or somehow there'll be some type of cancellation or infiltration of what we hold on to. Um, I feel like the discourse, I think of Socrates when he had Socratic dialogue. Now, some people say he knew exactly what he was doing, but he does seem to try to remove that sense of fear that it's not about right or wrong. It's not about who has the most information. It's about thinking and not being afraid to share what you're thinking, and also not being afraid to listen to how others are thinking.
Yeah. These are, I think, just key ideas that are behind what discourses used to mean. I'd like to play a little bit with that word intercourse as well, because I heard the conversation at the end that Anika was having with Amber, and they were talking about the problem we have now with the word diversity. Words can be hijacked. And the meaning of words tend to be fluid. It tends to be their use, and if a word changes over time, it changes, and then you have to think about using different kinds of words in different contexts. But inter is interesting because it means we're together. It means you're among, and so even the word interest is saying that there's something shared. If you have an interest, you're participating in something that's not you. So let's go there, but it's present in the word civil too. What does it mean to have civil discourse? Who'd like to pick that up, just to play with the words a little bit, what it's typically meant, what it could mean today?
A couple thoughts that come to my mind are just how it's not just a conversation, but it's a conversation that builds a community and takes place in the context of community. It builds the civitas, right? That seems to be an essential component here, that you can't construct truth, or you can't have a dialogue if there aren't other people with whom you're speaking, right? Which I find really a strong contrast to a lot of elements that we experience today, where it's so individualized and so compartmentalized and so, isolation, they say, or I've heard said, is the disease of our time. Loneliness is the disease of our time. So I guess that's an invitation for better classical education and more of it. So
Could one of you extend what Brian's just said? He used a Latin word. And I think everybody here studied a little Latin, and maybe not everyone who's participating has, but he used the word civitas, which means town, where people live together. And this is where we get the word citizen. It's where we get the word civil and civilized and civilization, even chivalry. So what did that word used to mean when we understood it better? Who wants to pick up on that?
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the etymological move from civilis, civilis to rude. I mean, we think of incivil now as not. It's completely divorced, I think, from its communal roots. I think people think of it simply like burping in public or something is incivil, but I don't think of it. They think of it as it's just because you don't do it, not because it is destructive of the community. So that whole notion that conversation is a communal good, I think is something that we've got to work on. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a communal good that people used to understand, and there were civil virtues. People understood what they were. That your responsibility as a citizen included civil discourse. It included a way of having conversation and a way of resolving disputes and disagreements. And it involved being informed. Like, this is one of the civil virtues is simply to be informed, to know what's going on in your town, to read the news. And I've been convicted of this lately because I don't know what about you, but I read the national news now, but I don't get the local paper. The local paper doesn't exist anymore. So how do I have to do that online, but I haven't subscribed. And so I don't know what's going on in Harrisburg, but I know what's going on, in the country. So that's, where there's forces. That's just maybe a technological or social media force, but there are various forces that are lifting us out of our community such that we don't have community the way, we did 100 years ago. And so maybe let's just talk about the problems. Why is it that we don't have civility? Because how can we have civil discourse if we don't have civil virtues? Maybe this is one we're trying to restore, and it can be inductively helpful, but other things would probably need to be addressed too. And by the way, our classical schools tend to be, at least my experience of them has been, that they tend to be new creations in this kind of barren environment. They tend to be creations of new communities. And I've had, when I was head of school, I remember moms coming in and spending a day or half a day observing the school and then saying things like, I didn't know something like this existed or could exist. And they would say, I didn't know that I was looking for something like this, but this is what I'm looking for, because they've never seen it incarnated.
Yeah, and I don't think as school people, and we all think about the laboratory of school rather than the theory of education, I think, because we've been in schools. But we have got to stress more. I always wanted to have what I would call a group requirement, where you had to be part of an experience that was not capable of being done by you alone. So you had to be in a chorus, or you had to be on a team, because we don't turn Algebra 1 class into a corporate exercise, most of us. It doesn't become that. People don't show up to go to parents' night to come and watch people do Algebra 1. But if you make people part of something that simply can't exist unless everybody is relying on everyone else, I think we've really got to, I mean, the romanticization about sports, I weary of. I'm an athlete, so I get it. It does do that, but there are other things. And I wish we could create an environment where a group conversation had the same feel to it that the soccer team does, or the chorus does, or something like that.
What an interesting idea.
Yes.
Make everybody be you know, participate in a chorus for a week and then see how the conversations go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anika, what do you think? You've been in
I mean,
music.
because I feel like school is so focused on the material or the content, the very exercise of civil discourse doesn't exist. Even those of us who are classical, I'm speaking to myself, we will get so caught up and I'm thinking now, okay, I have 3 weeks before school is over, and there's all of these things that have to be done. And are we really allowing our young people that opportunity to be in the practice of civil discourse? And how are we modeling that ourselves? Like when they're watching how we interact with their parents, with teachers, are they seeing us practice that? One of the reasons why I'm not trying to advertise my school, but it's making me think of the other philosophy that our school uses called the Sudbury model. And we're not fully Sudbury. I'm always very honest. I said, I know we don't follow all the rules of freedom that it's supposed to have, but there are elements of the Sudbury model that I feel are practicing that. It's just these pockets that the students have where they have to engage. There's these things called school meetings where they're talking about and debating, or I don't want to say debating, but having civil discourse about what field trip we should take, or certain decisions to be made in the school. They've even had conversations about teachers that they don't like, but we all are engaged. They're all in, and they're allowed to express that. I wonder how classical schools can, beyond just seminar on Monday or debate class, thesis class, kind of create space, a culture for civil discourse. And does it always have to be, and I'm asking this genuinely, this is not a rhetorical question, does the discussion always have to be around a piece of literature? Like would just the very practice of civil discourse actually prepare them for a seminar?
Yeah.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest that maybe the way that a classical school approaches its disciplinary practices could be a very rich territory in which the art and skill and practice of dialogue is taught, namely through restorative conversations, rather than being a punitive system of demerits or merits. Rather than that, really try and bring in these really interesting ideas that have been coming up in schools more and more in recent years about restorative conversations, restorative justice, and bringing in an expert who does conflict resolution and teaches that to the kids. That seems to me, even though that's a lot of that stuff is very new, right? It could be a really powerful way to bring it into a classical school and teach dialogue in a way.
Yeah, Bryan, we do that at Latin, a lot of it. So, the first question when somebody's done something is tell me about it. And I think as much as possible, if you can promote conversation in those tense moments, I think you are teaching people. There's a lot to be said here, Chris, on this. The first thing is I'm going to sound old. I mean, I am old, but get rid of the phones. We've got, their conversation cannot happen if they're around. It just makes everything more difficult. So that would be the first thing. I also think we've got to get more intentional about training habits of conversation, such like sentence starters. And if you disagree with someone, here's how you start. Here's what happens when people disagree. What do you do at that point? I don't think we're intentional enough. We put people in a circle. We have a text in front of them often, and we think good things are going to happen. Facilitators need much more training. And I think Anika's right. I've had some success of late of trying to train kids how to have conversations without also having the challenge of understanding the material. I was influenced by Debbie Meyer, who used to say that kids talk the way car talk used to work, for those of us that remember car talk. And I think if you listen to kids' conversation when it's not about academics, there's a lot more give and take, and they know more about how to have a conversation. I think we've got to teach them in that arena and then transfer it to what they see as a more academic venue. where all kinds of other issues are at play, such as, do I understand the text? Do I not, etc.
Thank you. Yes, you're pointing out that modeling is important, and starting young. And, it's difficult to pull in a kid at ninth grade who's been on his phone for
Yep.
5 or 8 years and then say, we're going to start really having great conversations about literature.
Yep.
It's a challenge. It's a problem. So the more we're able to work with children from elementary age forward, better. But I've also been very influenced by, one old method that was tried very successfully at the University of Kansas, the integrated humanities program there that lasted only for about 7 or 8 years, but it was so successful the university shut it down. But what they did is the professors, three professors, would have conversations in front of the students.
Yeah.
And without notes, and often they'd have a glass of wine and they'd be talking about a poem or a piece of literature, because students need to see what educated people do when they have a conversation. It needs to be modeled. Now, it used to be, like if you grew up in Anika's house, you're going to hear some interesting conversations at the dinner table. So, her children are going to learn dialectic and conversation because they've been blessed to have her, and look at all the books behind her. And she's read to her kids since they were, toddlers. And we know the studies show that means academic success. At least it's correlated with academic success. Just read to your kids, have books in the house. But we have a lot of kids with wonderful brains and wonderful souls that just have not been formed yet. And so we have to find ways of modeling. So I would like to pivot from what Diana said to examples. We've already cited a couple, but maybe from something you've read in the past, maybe something from the classical tradition itself, or something you've been doing in your school, or something that's really influenced you that would inspire us to have civil discourse, that maybe incarnates civil discourse. So let's hear some of your examples.
I want to share one that we use. It was very strong. We started off being a in-person, regular brick and mortar, Monday through Friday, 8 to 3 and aftercare type school. Then we went online. We went online for the virus and have stayed online because we started registering kids out of state, and it just has taken on a whole nother personality, which has really worked for us. So one thing we had to do this year was re-implementing this thing. It was called the Justice League. When we were in the building every week, the students would get together to just talk through conflicts they were having. And you could fill out a form and say, I want to come to Justice League. No, it wasn't even every Thursday. It was every day at 11 o'clock. It was every day, actually. And you could say, I want to come to Justice League to discuss somebody took my pencil, or someone pushed me on the playground, and it became such a strong part that no one was ever sent to the principal's office, because they would come with witnesses and they would sit there with, there'd be one teacher and several students who ran it, and they would talk about their conflicts, and they would have disagreements, but it became very civil and very strong, to the point it just managed all conflict and behavioral problems, because number one, they knew they had a place to talk about their issues, but they also felt like, oh my goodness, my classmates are going to hold me accountable for talking. They would even write each other. They would write up, hey, I want to talk with someone about the way my classmates spoke to the teacher. Like it got that serious. We struggled to bring that online, but now we're back to doing it online. We figured out a way to make it consistent online. And I have found that process is hard at first. It's very shocking, because you're sitting there looking and people are listening to you give your opinion. You have to listen to other people's opinion. But now we're seeing that it's starting to work. So I'm wondering if there's some type of built-in way, maybe not connected to just academics, where at least once a week, if not every day, the students are broken up into small groups to just talk through things without technology, with a teacher leading, maybe a leader be a student, and they're discussing various either topics, conflicts, and struggles they're having, ways they've disagreed with something the school has done, something like that.
It seems as if that could be merged with the literature that they study. And if literature was chosen, among other reasons, to morally educate children, you could appeal to, do you remember how Susan and Lucy got into this argument in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Isn't that similar to what's going on here? Or remember in Anne of Green Gables when Anne was, I think we also have to be harmonizing literature, story, narrative.
Yeah, Chris, more on the lines of what you're saying about modeling, not necessarily moral modeling, but I've had luck in teaching something like the Decameron and or the symposium of running our own version of it, right? So took a walk to Canterbury Tales, took a long walk with kids, and the assignment was that you had to tell a story en route. It's interesting how challenging that was for many. First of all, we don't give kids, think about how long their sustained talk is. It's not very long. And how long can they actually go? An older kid, I'm thinking. The little ones have those shaggy dogtail stuff, but that, and then the symposium too, right? You have to come, for the older ones, you have to come with some theory about whatever the issue is. I think that modeling is helpful and works.
Thank you. Well, David, Bryan,
Yeah.
examples and inspiration from your own reading and experience. Let's hear it.
Yeah. So I want to build on what Diane just was talking about. I love that idea, and you were earlier talking about this idea of sort of keeping pace with each other as an element of discourse, right? By being on the course. And I think one of the general practices that I've implemented in the schools that I've been the head of is just slowing down. Slowing down the pace, right? Especially in the charter school world where I work, we're a public school, so we've got to do state testing, and we've got you have this kind of I don't know, this frantic pace to contemporary society anyway, and it's exacerbated certainly by technology and the 15-second video clip and the constant scrolling. So taking the phones out of school, absolutely essential, but encouraging just a slower pace to classes. Not I have to get through this by X. I have to get through this book so we can get to this book because we have to finish these by the end of the semester. I would rather that you took the entire semester to read one book well and thoroughly together and to discuss it in a meaningful and thoughtful way than to rush through and not give a certain work its due, and to give students the ability to digest, right? And you can extend that out to periods beyond class time, lunchtime, for example, right? Guiding students through what it's like to have a civil lunch, not to gulp down their food as quickly as they can and move on to something else, but to have a slow, thoughtful approach even to eating together and engaging in conversations at table together. One of the things that I've done in the past is 1 or 2 days a week giving the students a topic of conversation, right? That's not related to school, but that they can discuss, and having faculty members sit with them to talk about that as well, and to model those habits of good conversation over a shared meal.
Oh,
How's
that's
that
great.
gone, David?
It's gone well. It depends on the grade. It's a habit that students have to develop, right? So initially,
Yeah,
so the topic has to be a good one, because otherwise it's like pulling teeth, right? It can't be a simple yes or no question. It can't be something that you can answer in a sentence or less. It has to be something that actually inspires conversation and that students are interested in. Otherwise it can be too slow.
We're spending a lot of the time when we're thinking about conversation about the person who's speaking. Has anybody figured out how to teach people how to listen?
Music. I mean, it's difficult, but I think it gets back to these assumptions and the way that children have been formed by their smartphones, etc. Yeah, but how would you answer that question, Bryan? What have you seen that's helped students to listen?
I have been thinking about this one a lot, and I wish I had a clear, crisp answer to it. When this brought up, how do you teach someone to listen? I recently developed a PD track on quintillion where we read excerpts from the Institutio Oratoria. And there's this excerpt that I wanted to explore more in some of the sessions we had, but we never got to. I put it in the materials, but we never got to it. Anyway, quintillion talks about how the voice of the teacher is like the light of the sun. And I've always been wondering, like, what? Okay, great. I mean, sure, the teacher is like kind of on this pedestal and it's all great, but there might be something to be gained from that metaphor, and that the one who speaks is someone whom you just appreciate and slowly take in and bask in a way. Yeah, it's kind of, it just shows, and like true to form for quintillion, it kind of comes just in this big block of text. And I find that there's a comparison there, that image so interesting. And I wonder, if anything might be drawn from that. But I am, to come back to where this question started, I wish I knew the answer to that. How do we cultivate the art of listening? How do we teach kids to listen better?
Well, there's
I
this
think-
wonderful essay by Joseph Pieper, who talks about music as a way of cultivating silence and listening. Because when beautiful music is played, you have to shut up and just you listen. And as Diane was saying earlier, if you're singing with people or if you're performing with people in, an ensemble or orchestra, you have to pay attention to your neighbors. You're doing something together. So I think music is a wonderful way to kind of tune and harmonize and model listening skills and dialogue. There's a sense in which when we have a conversation, it's musical. There should be something harmonious about it. Even what we're doing right now, there's a kind of interplay where it's something like an ensemble playing together, where maybe it's a little bit of a jazz improvisation, but we're riffing off of one another and so on. And to do that, to do what we're doing, has taken years of being a part of conversations and reading and thinking about things. Even doing it online, we're still looking at each other's faces and looking for our cues and
Yeah.
when should I speak and when should I call on someone? It's an art.
There's an art.
Following.
Does anybody?
I think again, I think the listening, I think that civil discourse has become a part of the culture of the school. I think sometimes we think of it in terms of a class, a time period. I think we look more so into the culture, the actual day-to-day life of the school. I wonder if listening would develop through that, living it out daily amongst. It's almost like how you model it to your students and how you relate to your staff and parents, and then just how you have pockets throughout the week or the day where kids are just engaged in this tradition of listening and talking and respecting one another.
Yeah. And of course, what David said is, I think, apropos about like having conversations at lunch. If there's going to be a topic, it needs to be the right topic at the right time. And so this is another art, because children will listen to something true, good, and beautiful that's been served to them by somebody who understands what they are really desiring, but might not know themselves.
Yeah, and I really feel like, Chris, you talked a lot about how there are these trigger words that we've become afraid of saying the words diversity or equity. And I've found that, first of all, I'm in a totally different world than what maybe out in the media when I think about this. And so I find, I feel like if we really could find a way to practice what we're talking about right now, I think we would actually address those issues.
Mhm.
They would actually organically be addressed. Diversity, equity, inclusion would actually be addressed in just how we create a culture where everyone feels heard and everyone can speak and share their thoughts and opinions. Because, school tends to be very, in itself, has its own political system. You have the student that gets to speak the most because they're the smartest. They have the honor society. They have all these things where people are vying for being the best or the greatest or first. But creating a space where civil discourse is a part of the culture, you remove that political stance or that political framework of a school, and you're creating a culture that is gives a sense of belonging to everyone. But it happens more naturally as opposed to doing it with a knee-jerk reaction
Yeah.
to address race and all that stuff.
It's it strikes me that there's a sense in which therefore the school needs to be a conservatory, metaphorically speaking, or a museum where the muses are present and there's surprise and there's beauty and there's the unexpected, but there's beauty. And like I'll give you just a very brief story of once when I was headmaster, we were gonna have a banquet and a donor hired this remarkable quintet that was going to play some Vivaldi at the banquet on Thursday night. And then I get a call on like Wednesday night, and the donor said, "By the way, you don't just have this quintet for Thursday night; you have them all day Thursday." I said, "You're kidding me? I mean, we haven't made plans for this, but we had this professional quintet that would be available at our school all day." So we canceled classes, at least for the entire morning, and we just brought them in this one common area that was carpeted. We put them in a corner, and we happily announced to all of the lower school there would be no classes for 2.5 hours, but they were going to listen to Vivaldi. And it just turned out that the lead violinist was a great teacher. So
Yeah.
she would pause and she would say, "Now I want you to listen. You're going to hear something that sounds like insects in this next piece. Do you tell me what insect you think it might be?" That kind of stuff. And they would just play this gorgeous music. And everybody was silent. Everybody was listening. And they were also surprised. And Chesterton says somewhere that the chief pleasure of man is surprise. So I think, it's part of what we do as artists, as liberal artists, is we are bringing to them some beautiful dish that they didn't know that they loved. And, we say, "You're going to love this." Well, what is it? Just taste it. Then discourse starts happening because they've forgotten what they're supposed to do or what we're commanding them or directing them to do, and they're doing what their heart and soul desires to do.
Yeah.
And that's to explore it, to come to know it better.
I really want to talk more about that music thing. I wasn't you were mentioning it, and for a minute I wasn't connecting with it. And then it reminds me now, when I did my dissertation. Okay, so when I taught the great books class at my parents' school, I would start the class with everyone laying on the ground with their eyes closed, listening to a classical piece. A lot of times, and I love Beethoven for this because his music definitely talks to me.
Mm.
And I didn't really at the time. I was very new to great books, so I wasn't doing it for any deep philosophical reason. I thought it would be very calming and get them to a place of being still. But when I did my dissertation research many years later, that was the one thing they mentioned, one of many things, but one of the things they mentioned helped them engage with the literature was that little 10-minute exercise of listening to a classical piece before we started the discussion. And I wonder what that is then. Why is it? Because they would lay down and I would say things like, "What do you hear? What do you think Beethoven or Vivaldi or whoever is speaking? What is he saying right here at this point in the piece?" And they would say, "I imagine a such and such." So I wonder why that's connected to civil discourse and listening and
There's been so much in Inca written recently about attention, and both from the distractibility to the mindfulness. But I think it is at the heart of this issue. And I think Chris is right that music gets us to attend. I was going to ask whether anyone knows if there is, and there's a lot about music and the role of that in the Republic, et cetera. But does anybody know of the idea of using music to encourage listening? Is that in the classical tradition that anyone knows?
I think and I don't know the tradition sadly well enough to give a great answer, but it's in the Republic, at
Yeah,
least peripherally, where Plato says that music tunes the heart
warms the
and
soul. Yeah,
yeah, and gives students a taste.
yeah,
And then this article by Pieper, who is in the classical tradition himself,
yeah.
he thinks that every student should do visual art as well. because he says, not because you want to be a published artist or a professional artist, because when you do visual art, when you draw or paint or sketch, you have to attend, and you see things that you otherwise don't see when you're working as an artist. And so, sketchbooks were just really common in the classical tradition, as well as commonplace books, because it's another way of attending. I hear something beautiful. I know myself well enough that I'm going to forget it if I don't record it. The only way I'm going to get it to my heart is if I immediately start speaking it, sharing it with someone else, recording it, coming back to it. So, but I think it comes back to being mesmerized by the muses, that we have to be bemused so that we have that kind of ecstatic moment where we desire to know. We become a wonder leading to knowledge. But I think there's no art, there's no formula to that. It's a kind of mystical art. And I think partly
I couldn't agree with you
to do
more.
it ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's what's so beautiful about the symposium. I really wish, if there were one text that I just wish everybody would read, it's that last part of it, because they understood so much that at the heart of the educational interchange is love, and that you, in order to attend, you have to essentially be falling in love with something, right? So we make it all so transactional in the worst way. So I agree completely.
Yeah, we would all talk about the things we love.
Right.
So the four of us love something, and get us going, and we're going to talk. And well, let's do this. We've got 10 minutes left, and we've got
Bryan,
another 15 people or so who are on the call, and we would love to have you record a question for us in the chat box. So we can keep talking, but it would be great if any of you who've been listening would like the panel to address a question or even a comment of yours. Feel free to just put it there. Oh, there's actually a Q&A section. So I'll read this question for the panel. Many classical schools seem to position themselves against certain trends in modern education that incorporate more communal approaches, DEI efforts, group work, project-based education, social emotional learning, restorative practice, etc. They tend to be skeptical of practices that encourage students learning from peers rather than the teacher. There is more seat work, desks in rows, more teacher-led instruction in classical schools. Maybe this is especially true in lower grades. How do you reconcile these reactions and trends in current classical education spaces with the need to develop civil discourse and the social, emotional, and conversational skills that come with that seem to be such a strong piece of what actual classical education means? To what extent does the discourse around the trivium honor the development of healthy, curious educational communities? Well, thank you for that question. Who would like to respond?
I've been talking a lot, so somebody else go, but I've got a lot of thoughts.
That's such a,
I love that. This is good.
That's an incredible question. I think classical education, I'll say this, let me say this real quick. I love, I hope I'm saying this right, Scholé Academy. It means, leisure for learning, and there's, if you go to classical academic presses, when they explain it, that there's another view of education that isn't what she's described here. I think sometimes, I haven't seen this with all schools, but I do sometimes see a trend, and I'm going to be honest and say, I think I've been guilty of this too in my school, where we have classical education, but because we all been not educated classically or in the true classical sense, we sometimes will try to fit classical education into the industrial model of education.
That's what we know.
That's what we know. And so we may have the content, right? They're learning Latin, they're reading great books, literature, but they're not really having a Socratic dialogue. They're reading the omnibus, but they have to say exactly back in their paper what the teacher would approve of. And when I'm saying omnibus, that's not I'm not saying that against the press of that, because I love omnibus, but I'm just saying it because we all have used omnibus at some point. And we have the content, but then it seems like we're also talking about the the teaching methodology needs to, it seems like we have the content is different than what's in traditional schools, but we're still bringing that content into our framework. And I was reading about there's a classicist that died this year. He was I think Penn State, I believe, and he sent some books to the school. I'd never met him, but his daughter had heard of the school, and he donated quite a few of his books from his library to the Living Water School. And I was reading about how he taught. When I let somebody else talk, I'm gonna go get his name so I can remember. And he was known for not giving any assignments. Every class was just a discussion, and it talked about the students talked about how much they learned in his class and how it affected them. I was really struck by his story on how he taught, but it seems like we still are a little bit nervous about leaving the comfort of the traditional way of teaching. So now I almost have like a question to your question. How should even classical teaching be different? Like we have classical content is definitely different. Like we diagram sentences. They don't do that in school anymore. They learn Latin. They definitely don't do that in school. They have rhetoric class, logic class. They work through their logic books and all that stuff. They learn geography and timelines. All of that is beautiful. That's the content. So now how is classical teaching different from the traditional way?
Yeah, classical teaching methods, methods have come and go depending on the time, place, the situation, circumstances. It used to be, 700 years ago, everyone was teaching in Europe in Latin. Every subject was taught in Latin. It was a Latin immersion. That now it's English. We teach English and we teach Latin. We might teach some Latin immersion courses. So the method changes, but there are some themes that are persistent, and I think it might be good to just go back to these assumptions, because I thought you teased out some remarkable assumptions. Civil discourse involves believing that truth exists. So that's going to affect your method. If you believe that truth exists outside of yourself and can be discovered, that your mind is able to discover, it's going to change the way you teach. If you don't believe truth exists, it'll change the way you teach. And then something else that was said, we come to the discussion being willing to change, to learn from others. That'll change the way you teach. We would actually respect other people because you want to learn from them. Another thing that was said is that it removes, we should not be afraid, because the truth sets us free. The truth is not afraid even of a dispute, because a good argument is just leading to truth. And so we enter into arguments happily, not as quarreling, but as two people working together to get to the same place. And then someone said as well that it's a communal good, that we need each other. Not only are we not afraid of each other, afraid of the truth, are we willing? I want you to help me. I want you to disagree with me, because I know I will be sharpened by you're going to help me to discover more of what's true. So I think the questions that this person's asking will be addressed to some, at least principally, by just those assumptions. Truth is real. Our minds can access it. We don't need to be afraid of the truth. Actually, we welcome it, and we need other people communally to help us find it. Then we should be having conversations, and the teacher should be esteemed like that son in some way, right? If the teacher is really just a more mature student and has virtue, I think there's a sense in which that metaphor starts to be, someone has said that beauty is a radiance of truth. And maybe there's a sense in which a great teacher, like the one that Nanika seems to be describing, he radiated something to these students.
Yeah, his name was Dr. Harry Costas Avery. And I was just amazed that I just really wanted to get to know him, because I was so honored that his books were passed on to the school. And he did. He believed. I think it's not even just it's believing in the search for truth, but almost like he believed in the students' ability to learn through the process. I feel like sometimes we're very afraid that kids won't learn simply through conversation and exploring or trying to discover truth. And I'm not saying we shouldn't really make sure they're learning other skills. I'm not saying that either. I wonder if there's a balance. And it seemed like the culture he created was very equitable. It was very welcoming to everyone. It was so powerful that even after they graduated, they would come by to want to have lunch with him and visit him, and they would talk about how his work or how his class inspired them. And it was all through conversation and hardly any assignments.
Can we go back for a sec just to the question, because I think the question, do we have time to keep going?
Yes.
Or do I have to?
2 minutes.
I think the question points out something that is crucial for those of us that are in classical schools, is that in what I think is a beautiful yearning for there to be truth, beauty, and goodness in the world, and a belief, not just a yearning, but a belief. And that sets us apart from many of our more relativistic counterparts, right? But I think we have to be really careful that that doesn't become dogma, because the tradition itself built in an examination of itself. That is what is so beautiful about the tradition, is that it was constantly asking itself, raising questions, Socratic and otherwise. So I think classical schools can retain both the notion that there is an authority in the curriculum, plus a pedagogy of inquiry and questioning. And so yes, they're the authority, yes, but we also use a pedagogy that is deliberately questioning and pushing and analyzing, so that we don't become dogmatic.
Thank you, Diane. That's a great way
Yeah,
to
and
sum it up. David, go ahead. Take us
Well,
home.
please, yeah. I think just to kind of take things down to, you know, the most practical level, right? Which is, how do we train our teachers to teach well? Ultimately, these are questions of prudence. That there's a time for the teacher to be the authority, to be the sage on the stage, right? If I were to walk into a kindergarten classroom and see kindergartners, I don't know, teaching each other phonics, probably problematic, right? When you're in, say, you know, a classroom, really at any grade level, talking about a work of literature, I would expect that there should be a much more kind of communal nature to the learning, a much more conversational approach to the learning. I would be just as concerned by, you know, a 12th grade literature teacher who is lecturing from the front of the room the entire 50-minute block or whatever it is, right? So there's questions of prudence and of pedagogy that have to be asked, but with the baseline assumptions about human nature and about the nature of truth that we spoke about earlier. You know, the question is, in this instance, what is the best means by which to help students to attain the truth? And sometimes that is the teacher stepping in and telling them the truth. Other times that is, you know, something different. And I think that, you know, you can if we go too far in the other direction, then what we end up with is the kind of relativism that we want to avoid as well, right? I've seen what was called a Socratic seminar, but was actually a vibe session, live in front of me, right? Talking about how the text made us feel, and putting forward theories about it that were just incorrect, not correct interpretations. That's indefensible in the same way that the teacher dictating the one and only and, you know, possible interpretation of the text from his podium is indefensible as sound pedagogy.
Thank you, David. That's well said. And as you can see, a conversation like this will just keep going. We don't, and that gets to Diane's point. You know, we're always inquiring, and
Yes.
because we haven't discovered all truth, and all these truths are in relationship with one another, and we're always weaving tapestries, and that will always be the case in an
Yes.
infinite universe. So it doesn't stop, and that's part of the exploration and the adventure. But truth does exist, and it's
Yes.
real, and that changes how we teach.
Yes.
Well, thank you everyone for your time, for joining us. We really appreciate it, and I want to thank the panelists. It's been good to get to know the three people I've met for the first time. Thank you for your time and contribution.
Thank you
Thank you.
so much, Chris, I love the topic you chose to really focus on. to unpack because it really did go into, I think what we talked about today can apply to K-12 or at the college level, no matter at any point, if you are in a place of instruction and you're part of this classical tradition community, that we are rethinking how we're doing teaching, how we're cultivating civil discourse in our communities wherever we are. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. I believe all of them will be at June 15th, so I'm really excited about that. Some of our speakers today won't be at June 15th. They were just online, but all of the panelists will be there on June 15th, so I'm excited about that. I want to take the last about 12 minutes for Bryan to share something I think is really important. Um, he has done a paper on, it's connected to westward movement and the classical tradition. I want everyone to understand, if you're watching these videos, if you thought these were going to be videos about just the African American experience, surprise, uh, this is about everyone's story. That is the passion, that is the mission, that is the purpose of redefining classics. That everyone, it's not a battle for whose story is welcome. It's for everyone. So, Bryan, would you like to take it from here?
Sure. I mean, we are at the end of the time that we had. I can give like a short 2-minute version, or I can give the full 10 minutes. What would you like me to do?
Well, the wonderful thing about it is I actually gave like a 30-minute like open space right here.
Okay.
So there's time, and I thought that's
All right.
important that you wanted to do that.
I'll go
So
ahead and share it then. And again, if those who are signed in or have been planning only to stay till 5:30, please don't feel like you have to stay. I'll go ahead and share my paper. And well, I'll keep it quick. It's a tight 10 minutes, I promise. I'm going to start by putting my handout there in the chat, and I'm going to share my screen right now as well, so you can see my presentation file, if I can bring it up. Here we go. All right. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the presentation slide? Okay, great. So let me tell you a little bit about what's going on here. I have been, I'm coming up to the end of my 5th year at Washington Latin School, but in the last 2 years or so, I've taken a lot of interest in what classical education is, how it's defined, and how it's enacted. And what happened in Colorado is an extension of that. So I'll go ahead and start reading. And again, it'll be a tight 10 minutes. As I approach the end of my 18th year as a Latin teacher, I am struck by how often over the years I've heard classics characterized as an endangered enterprise. The prevailing narrative is enrollments are declining, programs are closing, jobs vanishing, and those currently in the profession had best proceed with the utmost caution lest they soon find themselves without a job. And yet, 3 months ago, Arcadia Education published a market analysis in which the number of classical schools in the US is projected to grow steadily at nearly a rate of 5% annually for the next 10 years, at which point there will be an estimated 1.4 million students enrolled in a classical school. And if you look at handout 1, you can see a link to that market analysis. Really exciting stuff. I cannot wait to dig into this more deeply. Lots of great statistics too, if you get a chance to look at it. The proliferation of classical schools throughout the country in recent years corroborates this analysis in that market study, a market analysis that is. In fact, it was the consistent annual cluster of Latin teacher job postings in Colorado that first drew my attention to this region in my current research efforts. When an opportunity arose to deliver a paper at a workshop there in Colorado this March, I began reaching out to classical schools in the area about visiting to observe how they define and enact classical education. Within a matter of weeks, I had identified no fewer than 12 classical charter schools serving thousands of students, several thousands, in fact, within 130 miles of each other. To put this into context of Washington Latin School, where I am currently employed, there is but one classical charter school serving